The desert wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying with it the taste of dust and the promise of another scorching day. Red earth cracked beneath the merciless sun, stretching endlessly toward jagged hills that rose like broken teeth against the horizon. As evening approached, the sky bled crimson and orange, painting the desolate terrain in colors that seemed torn from the very heart of hell itself. Jake Sullivan stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun die behind those unforgiving hills. At 32, he'd already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age. His weathered hands gripped the rough wooden fence post, knuckles white beneath sun-darkened skin. The ranch sprawled before him, modest by territorial standards. But it was his 20 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and a ramshackle barn that leaned slightly eastward, as if perpetually bracing against the wind. He'd built this place with his own hands, alongside his father and brother. Now both lay beneath wooden crosses in the small cemetery plot behind the main house, victims of the cholera outbreak that had swept through the territory 3 winters past. His mother had followed them a month later, her heart simply giving out from grief. Jake had buried her beside them, alone, the preacher having fled town with half the surviving population. The horses in the barn nickered nervously, sensing something Jake couldn't yet see. Storm clouds gathered on the northern horizon, rolling in fast and angry. Lightning flickered within their depths, illuminating the approaching tempest from within. Jake had seen plenty of storms in his years on the frontier, but something about this one set his teeth on edge. He moved toward the barn, boots crunching on the parched earth. The animals needed securing before the storm hit. His prize stallion, a black Mustang he'd broken himself, pawed at the ground and tossed its head. "Easy. Midnight," Jake murmured, running a calloused hand along the horse's neck. "Just weather coming." Thunder cracked overhead, so sudden and violent that even Jake flinched. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, creating tiny craters in the dust. Within moments, the drops became a deluge. Wind slammed into the barn with enough force to make the entire structure groan. Jake worked quickly, checking that all the horses were secure in their stalls, that the feed was covered, that nothing loose could become a projectile in the gale. He was about to head back to the main house when he heard it, voices, barely audible above the storm's fury. Jake froze, hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. Visitors during a storm like this meant trouble. Nobody traveled in weather like this unless they had no choice. The barn door burst open, slamming against the wall. 3 figures stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and gasping for breath. Women. Jake's hand relaxed slightly on his gun, but didn't move away entirely. In the lamplight, he could make out their faces. All 3 bore a family resemblance. Clearly sisters. The eldest looked to be in her late 20s, with dark hair plastered to her head and fierce green eyes that swept the barn before settling on Jake. She stood protectively in front of the other 2, chin raised despite her bedraggled state. Her dress, once perhaps blue or gray, was torn at the hem and stained with mud. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the chattering of her teeth. "We just need shelter from the storm. We mean no harm." The second sister, perhaps 25, pushed wet auburn curls from her face, where the eldest was all sharp angles and defensive posture. This one had a softer look. Until Jake met her eyes. There was something wild there, something that reminded him of an unbroken horse. Her dress was in worse shape than her sister's, patched in multiple places and missing buttons. The youngest couldn't have been more than 20, with the same green eyes as her eldest sister, but none of the hardness. She clung to the middle sister's arm, shivering violently. Her pale blue dress might once have been fine, but now it hung on her thin frame like a shroud. Jake studied them for a long moment. Everything about them screamed trouble. The torn clothes, the exhaustion evident in their postures, the way the eldest kept glancing toward the door as if expecting pursuit. But the code of the frontier was clear. You didn't turn away folks in need, especially not during a storm that could kill. "There's hay in the loft," he said finally, jerking his head toward the ladder. It's dry up there. You can wait out the storm." The eldest sister's shoulders sagged slightly with relief. "Thank you. We're grateful. Name's Jake Sullivan. This is my place." He didn't phrase it as a question, but the expectation hung in the air between them. The sisters exchanged glances. The eldest straightened. "I'm Margaret. These are my sisters, Rose and Catherine." False names. Jake was certain of it. The slight hesitation, the way Margaret's eyes didn't quite meet his when she spoke. But then, plenty of folks in the territory had reasons for not using their real names. Jake himself had known men who'd left everything behind, including their identities, to start fresh in the unforgiving landscape of the West. "There's a pump out back for water," Jake said. "I'll bring some blankets from the house." "That's kind of you, but—" Margaret began. "Wasn't a question?" Jake cut her off. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." He left before she could protest further, jogging through the rain to the main house. Inside, he grabbed an armful of blankets and his mother's old medicine box. On second thought, he added some bread and dried beef from his stores. Whatever these women were running from, they looked like they hadn't eaten properly in days. When he returned to the barn, he found them huddled together in the corner, as far from the door as possible. Catherine, the youngest, was crying silently, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. Rose had an arm around her, murmuring something Jake couldn't hear. Margaret stood apart, keeping watch. "Here." Jake set the supplies down at a respectful distance. "There's some food there, too." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "We can't. You can and you will," Jake said firmly. "I've got plenty." Rose looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something passed across her face that Jake couldn't quite read. "Think you can handle us all?" she asked, a challenge in her voice despite her exhaustion. "3 strange women showing up in your barn?" There was something in the way she said it, part defiance, part something else that made heat rise in Jake's neck. He kept his expression neutral. "I reckon I can manage." Thunder crashed again, making Catherine whimper. The storm was getting worse. The barn door rattled in its frame, and Jake moved to secure it better. As he did, he caught sight of Margaret's hands. Her knuckles were scraped raw, dried blood visible beneath the dirt, fighting wounds, running wounds. "You can stay the night," he heard himself say. "Storm like this won't blow out before morning." Margaret nodded slowly. "We'll be gone at first light." Jake didn't comment on the obvious lie. Wherever these women were headed, they weren't going to get far on foot with no supplies, and at least one of them already half broken from whatever they'd endured. He climbed up to check the loft, making sure there were no leaks, no weak boards that might give way. When he came back down, he found the sisters had already wrapped themselves in the blankets, sharing the meager food he'd brought. They ate like they were starving but trying to hide it, taking small bites, chewing slowly. "I'll be in the house," Jake said. "You need anything, you yell." "Mr. Sullivan," Margaret called as he reached the door. He turned back, in the lamplight, with the storm raging outside. The 3 women looked like something out of a ghost story, pale, desperate, clinging to each other for warmth and comfort. "Thank you." Jake nodded once and stepped out into the storm. As he fought his way back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet, solitary life had just become a great deal more complicated. Inside the house, he stoked the fire and settled into his chair, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's bloodied knuckles, Rose's wild defiance, Catherine's terrified tears. He'd built this life on staying out of other people's trouble, on minding his own business and keeping to himself. But something about those 3 women in his barn had already begun to crack that resolve. The storm raged on, battering the ranch with winds that threatened to tear the roof clean off. Jake sat by the window, watching the barn, rifle across his lap. Whatever those sisters were running from, he had a feeling it would come looking, and when it did, Jake Sullivan would have to decide what kind of man he really was, the kind who protected his own peace at any cost, or the kind who stood between the helpless and harm. No matter the consequences, as lightning split the sky once more, illuminating the ranch in stark, brutal clarity. Jake knew in his bones that his decision was already made. Dawn broke harsh and brilliant, the storm having scoured the sky clean. Jake stepped out of the house, boots squelching in the red mud that yesterday had been dust. The landscape looked wounded, grass flattened, fence posts askew, debris scattered across the yard, but the barn still stood, and that was what mattered. He found the sisters already awake, helping to calm the horses that remained skittish from the night's violence. Margaret had her sleeves rolled up, revealing more bruises along her forearms as she brushed down a nervous mare. Rose was mucking out stalls with practiced efficiency, while Catherine distributed feed, speaking softly to each animal. "You know horses," Jake observed, not quite making it a question. Margaret glanced up, wariness flickering across her features before she nodded. "We grew up around them. Not many women handle a pitchfork like that," Jake said, watching Rose work. She paused, turning to face him with that same challenging look from the night before. "Not many women have to," she replied, resuming her task with perhaps more vigor than necessary. Jake let it pass. He grabbed his own tools and set to work alongside them, noting how they moved with the easy coordination of people who'd worked together all their lives. Nobody spoke much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of shared labor, of hands busy with honest work. The sun climbed higher, turning the mud to a sticky mess that clung to everything. Jake noticed Catherine struggling with a heavy water bucket and moved to help, but Rose beat him to it, taking the burden from her younger sister with a gentle admonishment Jake couldn't quite hear. "She's not built for this kind of work," Margaret said quietly, suddenly beside him. "Catherine, she's delicate." Jake studied the youngest sister. There was indeed something fragile about her, something that went beyond her slight frame, the way she startled at sudden noises, the way her hands trembled slightly even when she tried to hide it. "She's doing fine," he said finally. Margaret's mouth tightened. "She shouldn't have to." By midday, the barn was in better shape than it had been before the storm. Jake found himself impressed despite himself. These women knew how to work, and work hard. Even Catherine, for all her apparent frailty, hadn't complained once. "You'll stay for dinner," Jake said as they finished. It wasn't a question. "We've imposed enough," Margaret began, but Rose cut her off. "We're hungry, Maggie," she said bluntly. "And he's offering." Maggie, apparently, shot her sister a quelling look, but Rose just shrugged. "What? We are. The house is just there," Jake said, gesturing. "Wash up at the pump first." He went ahead to start preparing food, pulling out what provisions he had: beans, salt pork, some potatoes that were starting to sprout. Not much, but it would fill bellies. He was cutting the potatoes when the sisters entered, hesitating at the threshold. "Come in," Jake said without turning. "Sit." They filed in slowly, taking in the sparse interior. The house wasn't much kitchen and living space in one room. His bedroom through a door to the left, his parents' room to the right, still untouched since his mother's death. The furniture was handmade, functional rather than fine. Catherine's eyes landed on the small shelf of books by the window. "You read?" she asked, the first words he'd heard her speak clearly. "When I can," Jake replied. "You're welcome to borrow any of them." Her face lit up, the first genuine smile he'd seen from any of them. It transformed her, revealing the young woman beneath the fear and exhaustion. "Thank you," she breathed, moving toward the shelf like it held treasure. "Katie loves books," Rose said, settling into a chair with a groan. "Used to read to us every night when we were small." "Before," Margaret started sharply, then cut herself off. Jake kept his attention on the cooking, but his ears were pricked. Before what? Before they'd started running? Before whatever had driven them to his door in the middle of a killing storm? "Smells good," Rose said, clearly trying to change the subject. She'd pulled off her boots and was rubbing her feet, grimacing. Jake noticed the blisters, some broken and bleeding. "There's salve in that box on the shelf," he said, nodding toward his mother's medicine supplies. Help yourself. Rose found the salve and began tending her feet with a matter-of-fact efficiency. Margaret had taken up a defensive position by the window, where she could watch the approach to the ranch. Only Catherine seemed truly at ease, already lost in one of Jake's few books. You expecting trouble? Jake asked Margaret quietly. She stiffened, but didn't turn from the window. No. You're a poor liar. That got her attention. She faced him, green eyes flashing. And you're too trusting, taking in 3 strangers, feeding them, offering your books. Most men would want something in return. I'm not most men. No, she said slowly, studying him. I'm beginning to see that. Jake served up the simple meal, and they ate in relative silence. He noticed how Margaret made sure her sisters got full portions before taking any herself. How Rose kept touching Catherine's arm, as if reassuring herself the girl was really there. Family, he thought. Whatever else they were, whatever they were running from, they were family first. There's a town about 2 days' ride east, Jake said as they finished eating. Millfield. Sheriff there is a fair man. If you're in some kind of trouble. No law, Margaret said sharply. Too sharply. I mean, we just need to keep moving. Find work somewhere. Start over. What kind of work? Jake asked. The sisters exchanged glances. We can cook, clean, mend, Margaret said carefully. Honest work. Rose knows horses better than most men, Catherine added, earning a warning look from her sister. And you? Jake asked Catherine. She ducked her head. I can teach reading, writing, numbers. I used to give lessons. Used to before. The shape of their story was becoming clearer, even if the details remained hidden. Jake leaned back in his chair. Decision made. I could use help around here, he said. Storm did more damage than just the barn. Fences need mending. Garden needs replanting. Horses need tending. Can't pay much, but there's room and board. The silence stretched taut. Margaret's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. Why? She asked finally. Jake stood, began clearing the dishes. Ranch is too much for one man. Been thinking of hiring help anyway. It was a lie, and they all knew it. But it was a lie that allowed everyone to keep their dignity. We can't, Margaret said. It's not safe. Not for you. Let me worry about what's safe for me. Rose stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Maggie, we need to talk. Outside? She grabbed her older sister's arm, practically dragging her toward the door. Katie, stay here. Through the window, Jake could see them arguing. Margaret gesturing emphatically. Rose with her hands on her hips, giving as good as she got. Catherine remained at the table, thin fingers worrying at a tear in her dress. They're trying to protect you, she said softly. From us. From what follows us. Jake sat back down across from her. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the hollow of her cheeks. What does follow you? Catherine met his gaze, and for a moment she looked far older than her years. Evil, she said simply. The kind that wears a respectable face and owns half the county. Before Jake could respond, the sisters returned. Rose's face was flushed. Margaret's set in grim lines. But something had been decided. 3 days, Margaret said. We'll work for 3 days. Help fix what the storm damaged, then we move on. Jake nodded, knowing 3 days would become 4, then a week, then longer. Whatever was chasing these women, they were exhausted, worn down to nothing. They needed time to rest, to heal, to gather strength for whatever came next. The barn's dry, but the house has a spare room, he said. Was my parents'? You're welcome to it. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Rose spoke first. We'll take it, thank you. As the afternoon wore on, they worked together to clear storm debris. Jake found himself watching them, learning their rhythms. Margaret, always alert, always protective. Rose, fierce and bold but gentle with her sisters. Catherine, stronger than she looked when she thought no one was watching. When the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake stood at the same fence post as the night before, but now he wasn't alone. The sounds of life came from the house. Rose's laughter at something Catherine had read aloud. Margaret's voice raised in fond exasperation. For the first time in 3 years, the ranch didn't feel empty, and for the first time since he'd buried his family, Jake Sullivan found himself afraid, not of whatever pursued the sisters. He could handle men with guns and violent intentions. No, he was afraid of how quickly these 3 women had begun to fill the hollow spaces in his life, and how much it would hurt when they inevitably left. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of change. Jake gripped the fence post and prepared himself for whatever was coming, because something was definitely coming. He could feel it in his bones, see it in Margaret's watchful eyes, hear it in the spaces between their careful words. 3 days, she'd said. Jake had a feeling those would be the longest 3 days of his life. The moon hung fat and silver over the ranch, casting long shadows across the yard. Jake sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood without really seeing it. The night sounds of the desert surrounded him, coyotes calling in the distance, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. From the barn came low voices, the sisters talking among themselves. He'd given them space after supper, sensing they needed time alone, but curiosity and concern drew him from the house. Not to eavesdrop, exactly, but to keep watch. That's what he told himself as he settled onto an old crate near the barn door. Far enough away to give them privacy, but close enough to hear if there was trouble. Can't keep running forever," Rose was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "We're exhausted. Maggie, Katie can barely keep food down, and you haven't slept properly in weeks. And what would you have me do?" Margaret's voice was tight with frustration. "Wait for him to find us. You know what he'll do. Maybe we should have stayed and fought from the beginning." This from Catherine, surprisingly. Maybe if we'd told someone. Told who? Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Daniels. He's been in Morrison's pocket for years. Judge Carter, he owns him too. Face it, Katie, there was no one to tell." Morrison. Jake filed the name away. So their pursuer had a name. At least, that's not what I meant, Catherine said quietly. "I meant, maybe we should have told someone what really happened that night. About Mother?" The silence that followed was heavy with grief. Jake found himself holding his breath, the knife still in his hands. "Telling wouldn't bring her back," Margaret said finally. "And it would have gotten us killed alongside her. We should tell him." Rose said suddenly, "Jake, he deserves to know what he's risking." "No." Margaret's response was immediate. "The less he knows, the safer he is." "You think Morrison cares about that?" Rose challenged. "You think he'll just tip his hat and ride on when he finds out we've been here? You've seen what he does to anyone who helps us. Which is why we leave. Tomorrow." "You said 3 days." I lied. Jake heard movement, footsteps pacing. "I'm tired of running," Rose said. "I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, of jumping at every sound, and I'm tired of watching you carry this alone. Maggie, I'm the eldest. It's my responsibility. We're not children anymore." Rose's voice rose, then dropped again. "I can handle a gun as well as you. Better, maybe. And Katie's stronger than you think." "I know exactly how strong Katie is," Margaret said softly. "I was there when Morrison—" "Don't!" Catherine's voice was sharp. "Don't talk about it. Not yet." More silence. Jake shifted slightly, trying to ease a cramp in his leg, and his boot scraped against the wooden crate. The voices in the barn stopped immediately. "Who's there?" Margaret called out, and Jake heard the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked. "Just me," Jake said, standing slowly and stepping into the moonlight where they could see him. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check on the horses." The barn door opened, and Margaret emerged. Indeed, holding a pistol, a Remington .44 by the look of it. She lowered it when she saw him, but didn't holster it. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," Jake admitted. "Morrison, that's who you're running from?" Margaret's jaw tightened. Behind her, Rose and Catherine appeared in the doorway, their faces pale in the moonlight. "You should go back to the house," Margaret said. "Forget what you heard." "Can't do that." Jake moved closer, noting how Rose's hand had drifted to her hip where a knife handle protruded. So they were all armed. Good. "Man named Morrison killed your mother, and now he's hunting you." "That about right." The sisters exchanged glances. Finally, Rose spoke. "Close enough." "Why?" "Because we saw it happen," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And because we ran instead of letting him do to us what he'd done to her." Jake felt something cold settle in his gut. He'd known men like this Morrison. Men who thought their money and power gave them rights to whoever they wanted. He forced himself on her. "She fought," Margaret said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She always was a fighter, but he was stronger, and when she kept fighting, she couldn't finish. He killed her," Rose said flatly. "Beat her until she stopped moving. Then he turned to us and said we'd be next if we didn't cooperate. So we ran," Catherine added. "That night, took his horse and what money we could find and ran. He's been chasing us ever since." Margaret finished. 5 months now. Every town we stop in. His men show up within days. We've been living like animals, hiding, stealing when we had to. We're not criminals, Mr. Sullivan. We're just trying to survive." Jake studied them in the moonlight. 3 women driven to desperate measures, carrying the weight of their mother's death and their own narrow escape. No wonder Margaret watched every shadow. No wonder Catherine jumped at sudden sounds. No wonder Rose met the world with defiance. "This Morrison," Jake said slowly. "Big man, owns a lot of land. Half of Brackenridge County," Rose confirmed. "Maybe more by now. He's been buying up properties, forcing out smaller ranchers, those who won't sell." She shrugged, but the implication was clear. Jake nodded thoughtfully. He'd heard of such men, land barons who built their empires on blood and fear. "And the law is his," Margaret said bitterly. "Bought and paid for." "Think you can handle us all?" Rose asked suddenly, echoing her words from that first night. But now Jake understood the weight behind them. This wasn't just about giving shelter to 3 women. This was about standing against a man who killed with impunity, who had the law in his pocket and an army of hired guns at his disposal. "Yes," Jake said simply. Rose blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct answer. Just like that. "My father used to say that evil flourishes when good men do nothing," Jake said. "Been doing nothing for 3 years now. Hiding out here, keeping to myself. Maybe it's time that changed." "You don't owe us anything," Margaret protested. "This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you walked into my barn." Jake replied. "Besides, I've got no love for men who prey on women and call it their right." Catherine moved forward suddenly, reaching out as if to touch his arm, then pulling back. "You don't understand. Morrison doesn't just kill his enemies. He destroys them, their families, their homes, everything they've built. We've seen it." "Then why'd you stop here?" Jake asked gently. "You could have kept riding, found another place to shelter." The sisters looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Rose answered. "Because we're tired. Because Katie's sick from exhaustion and poor food. Because Maggie's about to collapse from trying to protect us alone. And because—" She paused, meeting his eyes. "Because something told us you were different. I'm just a rancher." Jake said. "No," Margaret said quietly. "You're a man who took in 3 strangers without asking questions. Who fed us, offered us work, gave us your parents' room. That's not just anything." The night wind picked up, bringing with it the scent of rain. Another storm building. Jake thought, seemed fitting. "If Morrison's men come here," he said, "I need to know you won't run. Can't protect you if you're scattered to the winds." "We're done running," Rose said firmly. "Rose," Margaret began. "No, Maggie." "He's right. We run now. We'll be running forever. And I'd rather die fighting than live as prey." "Hopefully it won't come to that." Jake said, "How many men does Morrison typically send?" "4, sometimes 6, Margaret answered, apparently accepting that the decision had been made. "Hard men, killers." Jake nodded. "I've got rifles in the house, ammunition. Tomorrow we'll see how well you can shoot." "I told you, we can handle guns," Rose said. "Shooting targets is different from shooting men." Jake warned. "We know," Catherine said softly. We've had to defend ourselves before." The admission hung in the air between them. Jake wondered how many close calls they'd had, how many times they'd been cornered and had to fight their way free. No wonder they moved like hunted animals. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Real rest. I'll keep watch tonight." "You don't have to," Margaret began. "Yes, I do. You're under my protection now. All of you." He met each of their eyes in turn. That means something out here. Rose was the first to move, touching her sister's arms and guiding them back toward the house. As they walked away, Jake heard her murmur something that might have been, "I told you he was different." Margaret lingered, still holding the Remington. "Mr. Sullivan, Jake, what you're doing, it's noble, but nobility gets men killed out here." "So does cowardice," Jake replied. "Go on, your sisters need you rested, not dead on your feet." She studied him for a long moment, then surprised him by saying, "You lost someone to men like Morrison. I can see it in your eyes." Jake's throat tightened. Not to men like him, to indifference, to a world that didn't care if poor folks lived or died. "But yes, I lost everything. And now you're risking what you've rebuilt for 3 strangers. Maybe that's exactly why I need to risk it." Jake said, "Maybe hiding away here hasn't honored their memory the way I thought it would." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "Thank you," she said simply, then followed her sisters to the house. Jake settled back onto his crate, rifle across his knees, and prepared for a long night. The moon continued its journey across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. He thought about the sisters, about the fear they'd been living with, about the man who hunted them. Morrison. Jake turned the name over in his mind like a stone. He'd known such men before, in the war and after. Men who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who stood in their way. But Jake had learned something in his years of solitude. Every man, no matter how powerful, had weaknesses, and every empire, no matter how vast, could fall. The night wind whispered secrets through the sage, and Jake Sullivan kept his vigil, guardian now to more than just memories and regrets. When dawn came, things would change. The quiet life he'd built would shatter like glass, but looking toward the house where 3 brave, broken women finally slept in safety, Jake found he didn't mind at all. Some things were worth the shattering. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon. 5 riders moving with the steady purpose of men who knew exactly where they were going. Jake spotted them from the barn roof where he'd been replacing shingles, the hammer suddenly heavy in his hand. "Company," he called down to Rose, who was working with the horses in the corral. She shaded her eyes, following his gaze, then cursed under her breath. "How many?" "5. Jake climbed down quickly. "Get your sisters. Everyone in the house." Rose didn't argue, just vaulted the corral fence and ran. Jake watched the riders approach, calculating. They'd reach the ranch in maybe 10 minutes. He strapped on his gun belt, checked the Colt, then grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the barn wall. The sisters emerged from various corners of the property, Margaret from the garden, Catherine from the chicken coop, both following Rose into the house. Jake positioned himself on the porch, rifle casual across his arms but ready. The riders came into clear view as they approached the gate, hard-faced men, trail-dusty and armed. The one in the lead was older, grizzled, with cold eyes that swept the property like he was cataloging everything for later burning. They stopped just outside the fence. "Afternoon," the leader said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. Name's Garrett. We're looking for 3 women, sisters. Heard they might have passed this way. Lots of folks pass through, Jake replied evenly. I don't keep track. Garrett's smile was thin as a blade. These would be memorable. Thieves. You see, stole from Mr. Harrison Morrison himself. Money, horses, even killed a man in their escape. That's so? Jake kept his voice neutral, though anger burned in his gut at the lies. Must be dangerous women. Indeed they are. Garrett's eyes moved past Jake to the house. Mind if we water our horses? Long ride from town. Pump's over there. Jake nodded toward the side of the barn. Help yourselves. 2 of the riders dismounted, but Jake noticed they kept their hands near their guns. The other 3 spread out slightly, trying to look casual but clearly positioning themselves. Jake shifted his grip on the rifle, just enough to let them know he'd noticed. You live here alone? Garrett asked, still mounted. That's right. Big place for one man. I manage. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Funny thing, we stopped at the Perkins place. About 5 miles back, Old Man Perkins said he saw 3 women riding this way during that storm a few nights ago. Jake shrugged. Perkins drinks, sees all kinds of things. Maybe. Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. But Mr. Morrison is a thorough man. He likes to check every lead. You understand? I understand you're on my property without invitation, Jake said calmly. You've watered your horses. Time to move on. The silence stretched taut. One of the men at the pump had his hand on his gun now. Jake could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then the house door opened. Margaret stepped out, and Jake's heart sank. But she wasn't running or hiding. She walked onto the porch like a queen, head high, and stood beside him. These men bothering you, husband? She asked, her voice steady. Jake blinked but recovered quickly. Just passing through. Dear. Garrett's eyes fixed on Margaret like a hawk on a rabbit. Ma'am, you look familiar. Have we met? I doubt it, Margaret replied coolly. I don't associate with saddle tramps. Color rose in Garrett's face. Now see here. The door opened again. Rose emerged, wiping her hands on an apron Jake had never seen her wear. Maggie, soup's burning. She glanced at the riders with calculated disinterest. We having guests for dinner? No, Jake said firmly. These gentlemen were just leaving. Pity, Rose said, her smile sharp. I do so enjoy company. Garrett's jaw worked. Jake could see him trying to reconcile the domesticated scene with whatever description Morrison had given him. 3 desperate fugitives on the run didn't match a settled housewife and her sister. How long you ladies been here? Garrett asked. Sir, Margaret said, frost in her voice. I don't believe my husband invited you to interrogate his family. Family. Garrett repeated the word like he was tasting it. And where might the 3rd sister be? Women like you usually travel in 3s. Before anyone could answer, Catherine's voice drifted from inside the house, singing softly. A hymn. Something about grace and redemption. Her voice was clear and sweet. Nothing like the terrified girl Jake had first met. That would be my youngest sister, Margaret said. She's delicate. We don't expose her to rough company. The insult landed. Garrett's hand drifted toward his gun, but Jake shifted the rifle just enough to catch his attention. Like I said, time to move on. Mr. Morrison doesn't like being stolen from, Garrett said. He's offering a substantial reward for information. Then I hope you find your thieves. Jake replied. Elsewhere. Garrett held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded to his men. They mounted up slowly, reluctantly. As they turned to leave, Garrett looked back. We'll be in the area for a while. If you happen to remember anything, I won't. No, Garrett said softly. I don't suppose you will. They rode off, but Jake noticed one man looking back repeatedly. He waited until they were well out of sight before lowering the rifle. They'll be back, Margaret said quietly. Yes. Jake turned to her. That was quick thinking. The husband bit. Rose's idea, Margaret admitted as her sister joined them on the porch. She said if we acted like we belonged here, they might doubt their information. It bought us time, Jake said, but not much. They'll check the story. Find out I'm not married, or Morrison himself will come to verify. We should go, Margaret began, but Jake cut her off. No, running now would confirm their suspicions. We prepare instead. That afternoon, Jake showed them where he kept the weapons. A small arsenal his father had accumulated, 2 more rifles, a shotgun, boxes of ammunition. He watched them handle the guns with grim familiarity. Where'd you learn to shoot? He asked Rose as she checked the action on a Winchester. Our father taught us, she said. Before he died, said women on the frontier needed to protect themselves. Smart man. He was, her voice softened. Morrison killed him too. Oh, not directly. But he forced Papa off his land, burned his crops. Papa's heart gave out watching everything he'd built turn to ash. Catherine, cleaning the shotgun with steady hands, added, That's when Morrison first noticed Mother, at Papa's funeral, said she was too pretty to be a widow, that she needed a man's protection. She refused, Margaret continued, politely at first, then more firmly. Morrison doesn't like being refused. The pieces of their story were coming together, painting a picture of systematic cruelty. Jake felt his resolve harden. Men like Morrison were a plague on the frontier, using their power to destroy lives. As evening fell, Jake positioned himself by the window while the sisters prepared supper. The domestic scene felt surreal after the day's tension. Rose hummed while she cooked. Margaret mended one of his shirts without being asked. Catherine read aloud from one of his books. Anyone looking in would see exactly what they'd pretended to be. A family. There, Jake said suddenly. Ridge to the north. A brief glint of light sun on metal or glass. Someone watching. They're out there, he said quietly. Margaret joined him at the window. What do we do? We wait. Let them think we're unaware. Tonight, we'll be ready. Dinner was a tense affair, everyone listening for sounds outside. As darkness fell, Jake doused the lamps one by one, plunging the house into shadow. Margaret, take the back window. Rose, the side. Catherine, stay low. Watch the front with me. They moved into position without argument. The moon was new, leaving the yard in deep darkness, perfect for an attack. Jake, Catherine whispered. I'm scared. Good, he replied. Fear keeps you sharp. Just remember what I taught you. Breathe, aim, squeeze gentle-like. What if I have to? What if I kill someone? Jake glanced at her pale face in the darkness. Then you live with it, but you live. Hours passed. Jake's eyes burned from staring into the darkness. Then, movement by the barn, a shadow where no shadow should be. They're coming, he breathed. More shadows, spreading out to surround the house. Jake counted at least 6, more than Garrett had brought earlier. Nobody shoots until I do, Jake ordered. Let them get close. The shadows crept nearer. Jake could make out individual shapes now. One approached the front door, probably planning to kick it in. Others moved toward windows. They were good, professional, but they were expecting sleeping victims, not an armed reception. The man at the door raised his foot. Jake shot him through the window. The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides as the sisters opened up. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Jake worked the rifle's lever, picking targets in the muzzle flashes. Beside him, Catherine fired the shotgun, the recoil knocking her back, but her aim true. The barn, Rose shouted. They're trying to flank us. Jake saw them, 2 men using the barn for cover, trying to get an angle on the side window. Hold your positions. He grabbed the second rifle, burst out the front door, rolling behind the water trough as bullets whined overhead. From this position, he had a clear shot at the barn. 1 man down, then 2, but more were coming, seeming to materialize from the darkness. Jake, Margaret's warning came just in time. He spun, firing from the hip, dropping a man who'd been creeping up behind him. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The survivors fled, horses pounding away into the night. Jake stayed behind cover, counting heartbeats, waiting for a trick. "Finally," he called out. "Everyone all right?" "We're fine," Margaret answered. "Some cuts from glass, nothing serious." They regrouped in the house, lighting a single lamp. Rose had a graze on her arm. Catherine's hands were cut from broken glass, but they were alive. Outside, bodies littered the yard. "Morrison will come himself now," Margaret said. "With everything he's got." "I know." Jake reloaded his rifle methodically. "But he'll find more than he bargained for." Rose laughed, wild and free. "Think you can handle us all?" she asked again. But now it sounded like a battle cry. Together, Jake looked at each of them. These brave, fierce women who'd turned his quiet life into a war zone. "Together we can handle anything." Catherine surprised them all by saying firmly, "Then we make our stand. No more running. This is our home now." Our home. The word settled into Jake's chest like a promise. Whatever came next, they'd face it as one. Morrison and his empire of fear were about to learn what happened when you cornered people who'd found something worth fighting for. Outside, the desert wind carried away the gun smoke, and the stars looked down on a ranch transformed from refuge to fortress, where 3 sisters and 1 lonely man prepared to write a different ending to their story. The days that followed the gunfight took on a strange, suspended quality. They buried the dead in a gully far from the house. Jake insisted on it, though the sisters would have left them for the buzzards. They worked side by side, reinforcing the ranch's defenses. But in between the preparations for war, something else was growing. Jake watched Rose teaching Catherine how to better handle the shotgun's recoil, her hands gentle as she adjusted her sister's stance. He saw Margaret's fierce concentration as she counted ammunition, her green eyes softer when she thought no one was looking. The domestic rhythms they'd play-acted for Garrett's benefit began to feel natural, real. "You're staring," Rose said one afternoon, catching him watching her work with the horses. Sweat glistened on her collarbone, her auburn hair coming loose from its pins. "Just thinking," Jake replied, not looking away. Dangerous habit. She moved closer, that familiar challenge in her eyes. "What about how different this place feels with you 3 here?" Her expression shifted, the teasing replaced by something more vulnerable. "Different good or different bad?" "Good," he said quietly, "though I probably shouldn't say so." "Why not?" "Because when this is over, you'll leave." The words came out rougher than he intended. "And I'll have gotten used to this." Rose reached out, her fingers brushing his hand on the fence rail. "Who says we're leaving?" That evening, as they sat down to supper, the air was charged with more than just the threat of Morrison's return. Catherine had made bread, badly burned on one side, but Jake ate it anyway, earning a grateful smile. Margaret had found his mother's recipe box and attempted a stew that was more salt than anything else. Rose had contributed wild onions from the field. "We're terrible at this," Margaret said, laughing as she tasted the oversalted stew. It was the first time Jake had heard her truly laugh, and the sound transformed her face. "You're learning," Jake said, taking another spoonful. "Besides, I've eaten worse." "Liar," Rose said fondly, "but a sweet one." As night fell, they took their usual defensive positions, but the darkness remained quiet. It was Catherine who broke the watchful silence. "Tell us about your family," she said softly. "You know our story, but we know so little of yours." Jake hesitated, then began. He told them about his father, a stern man who'd fought in the Mexican War and come west seeking space to forget. About his mother, gentle but strong, who'd made the harsh ranch into a home. About his younger brother Tom, always laughing, always getting into scrapes that Jake had to get him out of. "The cholera came through in 71, he said. "Tom went first, fought it for a week, but he was always slight. Pa followed 2 days later. Ma tried to nurse them both, wore herself to nothing, after they were gone. She just gave up. I'm sorry, Catherine whispered. Don't be. They're at peace. It's the living that carry the weight. Is that why you stayed here alone? Margaret asked. Carrying the weight? Partly. Also couldn't see the point of going anywhere else. This was home, even empty. It was still home. Not empty anymore, Rose said firmly. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Margaret stiffened. Riders, northwest. They scrambled to positions, but it was a false alarm. Just a pack of cowboys heading to town, drunk and singing. The tension broke, leaving them all laughing nervously. I need some air, Rose announced, heading for the door. I'll come with you, Jake said, grabbing his rifle. Just to be safe. They walked to the corral in companionable silence. The stars brilliant overhead. Rose leaned against the fence. Looking up, I used to dream about a life like this, she said. A ranch, horses, honest work, before Morrison destroyed everything. You could have it, Jake said carefully. Here. She turned to him, moonlight catching in her eyes. Is that an offer? Maybe. Would you consider it? With you? She moved closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. I might. Rose, he began, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. I know what you're going to say. We're in danger. This isn't the time. You barely know us. All true. But Jake, we might not have tomorrow. Morrison could come at dawn with 50 men. So why not take what happiness we can find tonight? She stood on her toes and kissed him, fierce and sweet. Jake's rifle clattered against the fence as he pulled her closer, feeling like a man waking from a long sleep. A throat cleared behind them. They broke apart to find Margaret watching, arms crossed, but a slight smile on her face. Catherine's asking for you, Rose, she said mildly. Something about the book she's reading. Rose squeezed Jake's hand before heading back to the house. Margaret took her place at the fence. She's half in love with you, you know, Margaret said conversationally. Has been since that first night when you offered us your parents' room. Margaret, I'm not warning you off. God knows Rose deserves some happiness after everything. We all do. She paused, studying the stars. I'm just saying, be careful with her heart. It's more fragile than she lets on. What about your heart? Jake asked quietly. Margaret's smile was sad. My heart's too full of responsibility to have room for much else. Keep them safe. Jake, that's all I need. I'll keep all of you safe, he promised. You can't promise that. Watch me. The next morning brought a different sort of tension. Rose hummed while cooking breakfast, shooting Jake glances that made his collar feel too tight. Catherine noticed. Of course, little escaped those watchful eyes, and her knowing smile made Jake fumble his coffee cup. Only Margaret seemed unchanged, focused on cleaning weapons and watching the horizon. They worked on strengthening the barn's defenses, and Jake found himself partnered with Rose. Their hands brushed, reaching for tools, shoulders touched as they worked side by side. The awareness between them was like electricity, making every casual contact significant. You're not paying attention, Rose murmured as Jake hammered his thumb instead of the nail for the third time. Whose fault is that? He growled, sucking his injured thumb. Her laugh was low and delighted. Mine, I hope. Catherine appeared in the barn doorway. Riders coming. From town, looks like. They assembled quickly, but this time Jake recognized the lead rider, Doc Harmon from Millfield, accompanied by what looked like half the town council. Jake Sullivan, Doc Harmon called out, staying well back from the fence. Mind if we approach? Got something needs discussing. Jake lowered his rifle but kept it ready. Come ahead, slowly. The delegation dismounted at the gate. Besides Doc Harmon, Jake recognized Stan Meyer, who ran the general store, and surprisingly, Judge Watson, one of the few officials in the territory Morrison didn't own. We heard about the trouble out here, Doc Harmon said without preamble. Dead men scattered around your property. Bullet holes everywhere. Care to explain? Men came onto my land uninvited, Jake said evenly. They got what trespassers get. These men worked for Harrison Morrison, Judge Watson said, his keen eyes taking in the three women standing behind Jake. And I'm guessing these ladies are why? These ladies are under my protection, Jake said firmly. So it's true then. Stan Myers said. They're the ones Morrison's been hunting. The ones who supposedly killed a man and stole from him. Only thing they're guilty of is defending themselves. Jake said. Morrison killed their mother. Tried to force himself on them. They ran, that's the truth of it. Judge Watson leaned forward. You willing to swear to that in court? I didn't see it happen, but yes, I believe them. I saw it, Catherine said suddenly. Stepping forward, her voice was steady though her hands trembled. I saw Harrison Morrison beat our mother to death when she refused his advances. I saw him turn to us with her blood on his hands. We ran because we knew no one would believe us over him. I believe you, Judge Watson said quietly. I've had my suspicions about Morrison for years, but no one would testify. Too scared. So what now? Margaret asked warily. Now, we have a problem. Doc Harmon said. Morrison's gathered a small army. Word is he's coming here personally, maybe as soon as tomorrow. He's telling everyone you murdered his foreman, that you're dangerous criminals who need putting down. Let him come, Rose said fiercely. With 50 men? Stan Meyer shook his head. It'll be a massacre. Not if the town stands with them. Judge Watson said slowly. Everyone turned to look at him. I'm tired of Morrison riding roughshod over the law. If we make a stand here, others might join us. Might isn't very reassuring, Doc Harmon pointed out. It's better than nothing, Jake said. We're not running. This is our home. Our home. He felt Rose's hand slip into his. Catherine moving to his other side. Margaret standing firm behind them. A family, forged in danger, but no less real for it. Judge Watson nodded slowly. Then we'd best prepare. I'll ride back to town. See who's willing to stand for justice over fear, Doc. You might want to stay here. I suspect your services will be needed. As the delegation departed, leaving Doc Harmon behind, Jake felt the weight of what was coming. Morrison wouldn't just bring men, he'd bring fury, wounded pride, the full force of his power. You could still leave, he told the sisters that night as they kept watch. Take my fastest horses, head for California, start fresh where Morrison can't reach. And leave you to face him alone? Margaret shook her head. We don't abandon family. Family. There it was again. That word that made everything worth fighting for. Then we make ready. Jake said, tomorrow, one way or another. This ends. Rose leaned against his shoulder. Catherine hummed softly as she cleaned her rifle. Margaret stood guard at the window. Outside. The desert waited, holding its breath for the storm about to break. But inside the small ranch house, love and determination burned brighter than fear. Let Morrison come, Jake thought. He'd learn what happened when you threatened the people Jake Sullivan loved. The lonely years were over. Tomorrow, they'd fight not just for survival, but for the future they were only just beginning to imagine together. The news spread through the territory like wildfire. Harrison Morrison had put a bounty of $500 on each sister's head, dead or alive. By noon, Jake counted 3 separate groups of bounty hunters passing by the ranch, circling like vultures, but not yet brave enough to attack. They're waiting, Margaret observed from her position at the window. Waiting for Morrison to arrive with the main force. Let them wait, Jake said, checking his ammunition for the dozenth time. Judge Watson should be back soon with whoever he could muster. But as the sun climbed higher, no help appeared from town. Doc Harmon, sleeves rolled up as he helped prepare medical supplies, shook his head grimly. Fear's a powerful thing. Morrison's had this territory under his thumb for years. Rose paced like a caged cat, energy crackling around her. We should strike first, take the fight to them before they're ready. That's suicide, Margaret said sharply. We hold defensive positions, make them come to us. While they surround us completely, Rose challenged. We'll be trapped rats. Enough. Jake intervened. "We stick to the plan. This ranch is defensible, and we know the ground." Catherine, who'd been silent most of the morning, suddenly spoke up. "Someone's coming. Just one rider." They rushed to positions, but the approaching figure raised a white cloth. As he came closer, Jake recognized him. Samuel Rivers, who owned the neighboring ranch to the east. He'd kept to himself since Jake moved here. Never friendly, but never hostile either. "Sullivan," Rivers called out, stopping well clear of the fence. "Got a message from Morrison. He wants to talk. Just talk." "Since when does Morrison talk instead of take?" Jake called back. "Since he realized half the territory is watching this play out." Rivers replied, "He's offering terms. The women come peacefully. He'll let you live. You've got 1 hour to decide." "Here's my answer now," Rose shouted, but Jake put a hand on her arm. "Tell Morrison if he wants to talk. He can come here himself. Alone. Otherwise, there's nothing to discuss." Rivers shrugged. "Your funeral." He wheeled his horse and galloped away. "You're not actually considering talking to him?" Margaret demanded. "No, but it bought us time, and it tells us something. He's worried about appearances now. This isn't just about hunting you anymore. It's about his reputation, his control." Doc Harmon nodded. "Make him look weak. Others might start standing up to him. He can't have that." The hour passed slowly. Jake stationed everyone at key positions. Margaret at the back of the house. Rose in the barn loft with a clear view of the approaches. Catherine with Doc Harmon in the main room. Jake himself took the front, where he could see Morrison's forces gathering on a ridge about a quarter-mile away. "Jesus," Doc Harmon breathed, peering through the window. "Must be 40 men at least." 38, Jake corrected, having counted twice. "Plus Morrison himself? See him there, on the black stallion?" Even at this distance, Harrison Morrison cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing expensive clothes that marked him as a man of means. He sat his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. "Here they come," Rose called from the barn. But Morrison didn't charge. Instead, a group of about 12 men peeled off, approaching slowly. They stopped just outside rifle range, and Morrison himself rode forward with 2 guards. "Sullivan," he called out, his voice carrying clearly. "I'm a reasonable man. Let's discuss this like civilized people." Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle prominent. "Nothing civilized about hunting women across the territory." "They're thieves and murderers," Morrison said smoothly. "They killed my foreman, stole money and horses. The law demands justice." "Whose law?" Jake challenged. "Yours? The law you bought and paid for." Morrison's face darkened. "Careful, Sullivan. You're harboring fugitives. That makes you complicit in their crimes. Only crime I see is a man who beats women to death and calls it his right," Jake said loudly, making sure his voice carried to Morrison's men. "Tell them about Mrs. Cooper. Morrison, tell them how she died." "Lies spread by desperate criminals," Morrison snarled. "Produce these women, and you might survive this." Movement caught Jake's eye. Rose, visible now in the barn loft window. Rifle aimed directly at Morrison. The man's guards tensed, hands moving to weapons. "I'd tell your men to keep their hands clear," Jake warned. "My people are excellent shots." Morrison's eyes flicked to the barn, taking in Rose's position, then scanning for others. "You can't win this. Sullivan, look around you. I have 40 men. You have what, yourself and 3 women? 4 people defending their home are worth more than 40 hired guns." Jake replied. "Home?" Morrison laughed, ugly and harsh. "This isn't their home. They're nothing but trash I should have dealt with months ago, just like their whore mother." The shot came from the house. Catherine, mild, gentle Catherine, putting a bullet into the ground inches from Morrison's horse. The animal reared, nearly unseating him. "The next one goes through your heart," Catherine called out, her voice steel. "Don't you dare speak of our mother." Morrison fought to control his mount, face purple with rage. "You just signed your death warrant, girl. Get off my land. Jake said quietly. Now, while you still can. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around. 1 hour, Sullivan. 1 hour to reconsider. After that, we're coming, and I'll burn this place to the ground with all of you in it. As Morrison's group retreated, Jake heard horses approaching from the other direction. His heart lifted as Judge Watson appeared, but fell again when he saw only 6 men with him. 6 men against 40. It's not much, the judge said apologetically as they dismounted. But these are good men. Tom Bradley, Jim Hawkins, the Colson brothers, Paul Martinez, and young Billy Chen from the telegraph office. Jake knew them all by reputation. Honest men, but not gunfighters. Still, they'd come. That counted for something. Obliged to you all, Jake said. Though I can't promise you'll survive this. Tom Bradley, a gray-bearded farmer, spat tobacco juice. Morrison's been bleeding us dry for years. Time someone stood up to him. They had less than an hour to prepare. Jake positioned the new arrivals strategically, the Colson brothers in the barn with Rose, Bradley and Hawkins at the side windows, Martinez on the roof of the house with a buffalo rifle, Billy Chen, barely 18 and trembling. He stationed with extra ammunition, tasked with keeping everyone supplied. Jake. Margaret pulled him aside. This isn't enough. We need to run, now, while Morrison's waiting. No more running, Jake said firmly. We make our stand. She searched his face, then nodded slowly. Then we make it count. She surprised him by stretching up to kiss his cheek. You're a good man. Jake Sullivan, my sister chose well. The hour passed too quickly. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky blood red, Morrison's force began to move. They spread out, encircling the ranch, cutting off any escape. Remember, Jake called out to the defenders. Make every shot count. Don't waste ammunition on bad targets. The attack began not with a charge, but with probing fire. Morrison's men testing their defenses. Jake held fire, waiting. Beside him, Catherine breathed steadily, the shotgun ready. Then Morrison appeared again, this time staying well back. Last chance, Sullivan. Send them out, and everyone else lives. Go to hell, Rose shouted from the barn. So be it. Morrison raised his hand, then dropped it. The world exploded. Gunfire erupted from all directions as Morrison's men charged. Jake worked his rifle mechanically. Aim, fire, lever, repeat. Beside him, Catherine's shotgun boomed, dropping a man who'd gotten too close to the porch. The barn! Someone shouted. They're rushing the barn! Jake could see Rose and the Colson brothers firing rapidly. But there were too many. Morrison had sent the bulk of his force that direction, recognizing it as the weak point. Catherine, stay here, Jake ordered, rushing from the house. He sprinted across open ground, bullets whining past, diving through the barn door just as a wave of attackers reached it. The fight inside was brutal, close quarters chaos. Jake used his rifle as a club when men got too close. Felt Rose at his back, heard her fierce war cry as she fought. One of the Colson brothers was down, blood spreading beneath him. We can't hold, Rose gasped, reloading with bloody fingers. We don't have to, Jake said. Just long enough. Long enough for what? He wasn't sure. But they fought on, desperate, savage, through the melee. Jake caught glimpses of the continuing battle, Martinez's buffalo rifle booming from the roof, Margaret appearing at windows like a ghost, firing and vanishing. Then, impossibly, Jake heard something that made his heart leap. Hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, and a voice roaring. For justice, for the law. Sheriff Thompson from Millfield burst onto the scene with 20 deputies, catching Morrison's men from behind. The tide turned in seconds, attackers becoming defenders, hunters becoming hunted. The sheriff! Billy Chen was shouting from the house. He brought help! Later, Jake would learn that Judge Watson's telegram had finally stirred the territorial governor to action, that Sheriff Thompson had been waiting for just such an excuse to move against Morrison. But in that moment, all that mattered was that help had come. The battle became a rout. Morrison's hired guns, caught between the ranch defenders and the lawmen. threw down their weapons, or fled. Jake emerged from the barn, supporting a wounded Rose, to see Morrison himself trying to escape. It was Catherine who stopped him. Quiet, gentle Catherine stepped into his path, shotgun raised. "For our mother," she said simply, and pulled the trigger. Morrison's horse screamed and fell, pinning the man beneath it. He lay there cursing, leg clearly broken, as Sheriff Thompson's men surrounded him. "Harrison Morrison," the sheriff announced formally. "You're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of later." As the sun set on the blood-stained ranch, Jake surveyed the aftermath. They'd lost one of the Colson brothers, and several others bore wounds, but they'd survived. More than that, they'd won. "It's over," Margaret said wonderingly, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "No," Jake corrected, pulling Rose closer despite her wounded arm. "It's just beginning." He looked at the three sisters, brave, beautiful, battered but unbroken. His family now, forged in fire and sealed in blood. The ranch would need rebuilding. The future remained uncertain. But none of that mattered. They were home. The ranch bore its scars like badges of honor, bullet holes in the walls, blood-darkened earth, the barn door hanging crooked on its hinges. Jake stood surveying the damage as Doc Harmon finished bandaging Rose's arm. She'd taken a bullet defending the barn, though she'd hidden the wound until the fighting was done. "You'll need to keep it clean," Doc warned. "No heavy lifting for at least 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Rose protested. "We've got repairs to make, stock to tend, which can all wait until you're healed," Jake said firmly. Margaret and Catherine nodded agreement, forming a united front that made Rose scowl. Sheriff Thompson approached, notebook in hand. "I'll need statements from all of you for the trial. Morrison's already trying to twist the story, claiming he was just trying to recover stolen property. Let him claim whatever he wants." Margaret said coldly, "We'll tell the truth, and this time, people will listen." The sheriff had set up temporary headquarters in Millfield's courthouse, where Morrison sat chained in a cell. His broken leg splinted. Jake accompanied the sisters to town the next day, their wagon escorted by armed deputies. Word had spread quickly, and the streets were lined with curious onlookers. "Murderers!" someone hissed as they passed. "Heroes!" another countered loudly. About time someone stood up to Morrison. The town was split. Jake realized. Morrison's money and influence ran deep, and not everyone was ready to accept that their longtime benefactor was a monster. At the courthouse, they found a crowd gathered, some supporting Morrison, others calling for justice. "This will get ugly," Judge Watson warned as they entered. "Morrison's hired the best lawyers money can buy. They'll try to tear you ladies apart on the stand." "Let them try," Rose said, chin raised despite her pallor from the wound. The preliminary hearing was set for the following week. Jake insisted the sisters stay at the ranch rather than in town, where Morrison's remaining supporters might cause trouble. They spent the days preparing their testimony and nights keeping watch, though the immediate danger had passed. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Catherine made her revelation. They were sitting around the table after supper, oil lamps casting warm light, when she suddenly said, "I kept a journal. Everything Morrison did, every threat, every visit. I hid it when we ran." Her sisters stared at her. "Katie, why didn't you say something before?" Margaret asked. "I was scared. I thought if Morrison knew about it, he'd kill us for certain. But it's all there, dates, times, witnesses, even what he did to Mama." "Where is it?" Jake asked gently. "Hidden in our old house, in the root cellar, behind a loose stone." Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. "I used to write in it every night, to keep myself sane." Jake and Rose exchanged glances. Their old ranch was 2 days' ride, in the heart of Morrison's territory. But that journal could be the difference between justice and Morrison walking free. "I'll go," Jake said. "Not alone." Rose immediately protested. "Your arm is fine." She glared at him. "We do this together or not at all." In the end, They all went. Sheriff Thompson provided 2 deputies as escort, understanding the journal's importance. The journey was tense, every rider on the horizon a potential threat. But they reached the abandoned ranch without incident. The place was a ruin. Morrison had burned the main house, leaving only blackened timbers and memories. The barn still stood, and beside it, the entrance to the root cellar. Catherine led them down into the musty darkness, counting stones along the wall. "Here," she whispered, working a stone loose. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal, pages covered with her neat handwriting. Jake lit a lantern and read a few entries, his jaw tightening. The systematic harassment, the escalating threats, the final horrible night, it was all there in painful detail. "This changes everything," one of the deputies breathed. "This is evidence of a pattern going back years." They returned to town to find chaos. Morrison's lawyers had been busy, spreading rumors that the sisters were fortune hunters who'd seduced and murdered Morrison's foreman for his money. A mob had gathered outside the courthouse, and not all of them supported the sisters. "Whores!" someone shouted as their wagon passed. Jake's hand went to his gun, but Margaret touched his arm. "Don't! That's what they want, to provoke us into violence." They made it into the courthouse, where Judge Watson reviewed the journal with growing anger. "This is damning," he said, "but Morrison's lawyers will claim it's fabricated. We need corroborating witnesses." "I know some," Catherine said quietly. "Other women, Morrison, bothered. They might speak up now that he's in jail." Over the next days, a stream of people came forward. The widow Thompson, whose husband had died mysteriously after refusing to sell water rights. The Martinez family, run off their land by Morrison's men, Sarah Palmer, who still bore scars from Morrison's attentions. The journal gave them courage, and their testimonies painted a picture of a man who'd terrorized the county for years. The trial began on a hot morning, the courthouse packed to capacity. Morrison sat at the defendant's table, well-dressed and confident despite his chains. His lawyers, 3 of them from the Capitol, looked like predators ready to strike. Jake sat with the sisters in the gallery, feeling their tension. Rose's hand found his, squeezing tight as the prosecutor began laying out the case. The journal was entered into evidence, each damning entry read aloud. Morrison's face darkened with each revelation, his veneer of respectability cracking. Then it was time for testimony. Margaret went first, voice steady as she recounted their mother's death. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Pemberton, attacked immediately. "Isn't it true you and your sisters were desperate for money? We had our ranch. We needed nothing from Morrison. A failing ranch, heavily mortgaged. Morrison offered to help, didn't he? He offered to make us his mistresses," Margaret said clearly. "When we refused, he killed our mother." The questioning grew more brutal, but Margaret held firm. Then Rose took the stand, fierce and defiant, matching Pemberton word for word. When he suggested she'd invited Morrison's attention, she laughed in his face. "I wouldn't invite that man's attention if he was the last person on earth," she said. "He was a monster who thought money gave him the right to take whatever he wanted." But it was Catherine's testimony that broke the case open. Quiet, gentle Catherine transformed on the stand, her soft voice carrying to every corner of the room as she read from her journal. Her words painted a picture so vivid, so horrible, that several women in the gallery wept openly. "And then he struck Mama again," she read, her voice breaking. "She fell and didn't get up. There was so much blood. He turned to us and said we belong to him now. That's when we ran." "Fiction," Pemberton declared. "Pure fiction written after the fact to support your claims." "Then how do you explain this?" the prosecutor asked, producing a new piece of evidence, Morrison's own ledger, seized from his office, showing payments to men for special services on the dates the journal mentioned violence. The courtroom erupted. Morrison lunged to his feet, cursing, having to be restrained by guards. His carefully maintained facade shattered completely, revealing the brutal man beneath. "They're mine," he roared. I paid for them. Their father owed me everything." The words sealed his fate. The jury didn't even need to deliberate long. Guilty on all counts. Murder, conspiracy, intimidation. The judge's sentence was swift hanging, to be carried out within the month. As they left the courthouse, the crowd's mood had shifted entirely. People reached out to touch the sisters, to thank them for their courage. Women who'd suffered in silence for years wept with relief. Men who'd been too frightened to stand against Morrison shook Jake's hand. "It's over," Catherine said wonderingly as they reached their wagon. "It's really over." "No," Jake corrected gently, helping her up. "Now it begins, the real work of healing, of building something new." They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting. The buildings still bore their battle scars, but somehow the place looked different, hopeful, like it was ready for a new chapter. That night, they gathered on the porch, watching the stars appear. Rose leaned against Jake's shoulder, her wounded arm in a sling. Margaret sat with Catherine, an arm around her youngest sister. The silence was comfortable, peaceful in a way it had never been before. "What now?" Rose asked eventually. "Now we rebuild," Jake said. "Make this place what it should be, a real home." "Together?" There was vulnerability in Rose's voice, a question about more than just the ranch. "Together," Jake confirmed, pressing a kiss to her hair. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Good, because I've been thinking about expanding the horse operation. With Morrison's land being broken up and sold, we could buy the water rights, bring in better breeding stock. Already planning." Rose laughed. "Some things never change." "Some things shouldn't," Jake said, looking at each of them. His family, tested by fire and stronger for it. In town, Harrison Morrison sat in his cell, awaiting the hangman. His empire was crumbling, his victims finding their voices at last. Justice, so long delayed, had finally arrived. But at the Sullivan Ranch, they weren't thinking about Morrison anymore. They were thinking about the future, about the horses Rose would train, the students Catherine would teach, the home Margaret would help build, about the life they'd create together from the ashes of their pain. The night wind whispered across the desert, carrying away the last echoes of fear and violence. In its place, it brought the promise of new beginnings, of love strong enough to overcome any darkness. They were home, they were family, and that was enough. The sun was setting over Millfield as they gathered in the dusty main street. Half the town had turned out, some from morbid curiosity, others seeking closure for years of fear and oppression. Jake stood with the sisters near the courthouse, watching as the gallows platform loomed against the orange sky. Harrison Morrison was brought out in chains, but even now, facing death, his arrogance remained. His eyes swept the crowd with contempt until they found the sisters. The hatred that blazed there made Catherine step closer to Margaret. "Any last words?" Sheriff Thompson asked formally. Morrison's lips curled. "This town will regret this day. You think you've won something? You've destroyed the very man who built this place." "You built nothing," Rose called out, her voice carrying clearly. "You stole, you murdered, you terrorized. The only thing you built was fear." Morrison's face contorted, but before he could respond, the hood was pulled over his head. Jake felt Rose's hand slip into his, Margaret and Catherine pressing close on his other side. When the trapdoor opened and Morrison fell, a collective sigh seemed to run through the crowd. It was over, truly over. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in small groups, some weeping, others embracing. Years of oppression didn't end easily, but the healing could finally begin. "Let's go home," Jake said quietly. The ride back to the ranch was subdued. Justice had been served, but watching a man die, even a man like Morrison, left its mark. They were almost to the gate when Catherine suddenly said, "I don't feel free yet. Is that wrong?" "No," Margaret assured her. "Freedom isn't just about Morrison being gone. It's about learning to live without fear again. That takes time." Over the following weeks, the territory transformed. Morrison's holdings were broken up and sold, many to the families he'd driven off their lands. The corrupt officials who'd supported him fled or faced trial themselves. Judge Watson worked tirelessly to restore real law and order. At the ranch, life settled into new rhythms. Rose's arm healed, and she threw herself into training horses with an enthusiasm that made Jake's heart swell. She had a gift with the animals, gentle but firm, and word spread quickly. Soon, ranchers were bringing their wild horses to her. Margaret proved to have a sharp mind for business. She negotiated the purchase of water rights and additional grazing land, transforming their modest operation into something that could truly prosper. In the evenings, she kept the books, planning for a future that now seemed possible. Catherine began teaching local children, transforming the barn loft into a makeshift schoolroom. Her gentleness, once seeming like weakness, proved to be her greatest strength. Children who'd witnessed too much violence bloomed under her patient care. And Jake found himself at the center of a family he'd never expected. He and Rose were married on a crisp autumn morning, with Margaret and Catherine as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Rose wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and when she smiled at him at the altar, Jake felt his heart might burst. "Think you can handle me?" she whispered as they exchanged vows, echoing that first challenge. "For the rest of my life," he promised. Winter came gently that year, bringing needed rain without the violent storms of the past. The ranch prospered, the horses Rose trained fetching good prices, Catherine's school growing to need a proper building in town. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, Margaret surprised them all. "I've been corresponding with someone," she said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Thomas Bradley, from the next county. He's a widower, has 2 young children. He'd like to court me." "The lawyer who helped with Morrison's trial?" Rose asked, grinning. "I wondered why you kept finding excuses to go to town. He's a good man." Jake said, "You deserve happiness too." Margaret: "I know, I spent so long protecting everyone else. I forgot I might want something for myself." "Then it's time to remember," Catherine said firmly. Spring brought more changes. Margaret married her Thomas in a ceremony at the ranch, his children shy but warming quickly to their new aunts. Catherine, no longer the frightened girl who'd arrived in a storm, accepted a teaching position at the new school in town, though she still lived at the ranch. One morning, Jake found Rose being sick behind the barn. When she saw his concerned face, she managed a weak smile. "Don't look so worried. It's natural enough when you're expecting." The joy that flooded through him nearly knocked him off his feet. "A baby? By harvest time? Doc Harmon thinks?" She let him pull her close, resting her head on his chest. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it." They told the others at dinner. Margaret cried. Catherine laughed, and they all talked over each other, making plans. A nursery, in Jake's parents' old room. Baby clothes to sew, names to consider. That night, as Jake sat on the porch with Rose beside him, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that violent storm that drove 3 desperate women to his door, through battles and trials, to this moment of perfect peace. "What are you thinking?" Rose asked, reading his contemplative mood. "About how empty this place was before you 3 arrived. How I was just existing, not living. And now I can't imagine life any other way." Rose smiled, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Good, because I plan on filling this ranch with children and laughter and so much chaos you'll long for your quiet days." "Never," Jake said firmly. "Those days are gone and I don't want them back." The moon rose over the desert, full and bright. In town, where Morrison's grand house once stood, a new courthouse was being built, a symbol of justice restored. The sisters who'd arrived as hunted fugitives were now pillars of the community, their courage having inspired others to stand against tyranny. Catherine joined them on the porch, a book in her hand. "Listen to this," she said, settling into a chair. "I've been writing our story, not for publication, just to remember, to make sense of it all." "Read it," Margaret said. appearing in the doorway with her husband. Catherine's clear voice filled the night air, telling their tale of loss and fear, of desperate flight and unexpected sanctuary, of love found in the midst of danger and justice finally served. When she finished, they sat in comfortable silence. "It needs an ending," Thomas observed. "It doesn't have one yet." Catherine replied, "The story's still being written." Jake looked around at his family, his wife carrying their child, his sisters-in-law who'd become as dear as blood relatives, their growing circle of love and belonging. The ranch that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with life and promise. "Then we'll write it as we go," he said. "Day by day, year by year, together." Rose squeezed his hand. "Together," she agreed. The desert wind whispered through the sage, no longer carrying fear or loneliness, but the promise of all the tomorrows to come. In the barn, horses nickered softly. From the house came the sound of laughter as Margaret teased Thomas about something. Catherine hummed as she made notes in her journal. This was what they'd fought for, Jake realized. Not just survival, not just justice, but this, the right to build a life filled with love and hope and family. Morrison had tried to steal that from them, but he'd failed. In the end, love had proven stronger than fear, courage more powerful than cruelty. As they finally headed inside, Rose paused at the door, looking back at the moon-drenched ranch. "Do you remember that first night when we asked if you could handle us all?" "Every detail," Jake confirmed. "You never really answered. You know, not directly." Jake pulled her close, thinking of all they'd survived, all they'd built. All that was yet to come. "I think I've proven my answer by now." Rose's laugh was bright as starlight. "Yes, Jake Sullivan. I think you have." They went inside together, to warmth and light and family. Leaving the ghosts of the past to fade in the desert wind, the ranch stood strong beneath the stars, no longer a refuge from life but a celebration of it. 3 sisters and 1 cowboy had faced down evil and won the greatest prize of all, a future worth living for. In the years to come, when Catherine's students asked about courage, she would tell them this story. When Rose's children wondered about standing up to bullies, she would share these memories. When Margaret's stepchildren needed to understand that family was more than blood, she would speak of that stormy night when 3 desperate women found sanctuary and a lonely man found purpose. The story would grow in the telling, as stories do, but the heart of it would remain true. That love conquers fear, that family is what you make it, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you open your door to strangers in a storm. Thank you all for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Jake and the sisters' journey. Your support means everything.